It started on a cold Thursday morning, the kind that makes a city seem quieter than it should be. Even in the heart of Washington, D.C., with its buzz of politics and press, the sidewalk on 14th Street NW was subdued. Commuters hunched into coats, eyes down, minds already in boardrooms or coffee shops. Among them stood an elderly black man, hands tucked into the deep pockets of his long charcoal overcoat, waiting for the light to change. Officer Darren Holtz spotted him from his patrol car across the intersection. Something about the man, maybe the stillness, maybe the way he didn't rush like everyone else, snagged Darren's attention. He narrowed his eyes. The man didn't fit. No briefcase, no earbuds, no phone in hand. Just a silent figure, on the corner. Darren pulled his cruiser to the curb. The man heard the car before he saw it. He turned slightly, just enough to glimpse the flashing lights and the officer stepping out. His face didn't change. Not with surprise, annoyance, or fear. Just the patient gaze of someone who had waited out worse storms. "Sir," Darren called, out, approaching with measured authority. "You all right this morning?" The man nodded. "Quite all right, officer." "You live around here?" A pause. "Does it matter?" Darren's posture stiffened. His fingers hovered near his utility belt. "It does when I ask." A few passers-by slowed, sensing tension. The man remained calm. "I'm on my way to work. Just waiting for the light. Mind if I see some ID?" The question hung in the air like fog. The man didn't flinch, didn't move. "Is there a reason you're asking me specifically?" he asked gently. Darren's voice hardened. "I ask the questions. You answer them. ID. Now." For the first time, the man shifted fully to face him. He looked older up close, maybe late 70s, but stood with a dignity that erased any sense of fragility. He reached into his coat slowly, deliberately, and produced a leather wallet. No sudden movements, no aggression, just calm compliance worn like an old suit. Darren snatched it and flipped it open. "Thomas Ridley," he read. "That's you?" "It is." Darren narrowed his eyes at the card tucked behind the driver's license. Black lettering on cream cardstock, embossed seal of the United States. He glanced at it briefly, then laughed, short and dismissive. "What's this supposed to be, a joke?" Thomas didn't answer. Darren scowled. "Sit down right here on the curb." "I will not. You're refusing a lawful order? I'm refusing an unlawful one." Darren reached for his radio. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Not many, but enough. A young woman pulled out her phone and started recording. The man remained upright, eyes steady, voice even. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I am not resisting. You are escalating." "Sit down." Darren's voice rose with each syllable. "I advise you to take a breath," Thomas said quietly, "and perhaps read the card again." Darren's cheeks flushed. He looked at the card once more. This time he saw it. The Honorable Thomas Ridley, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. Silence fell like a dropped gavel. A security detail SUV pulled up moments later, lights silent. Two men in suits stepped out briskly. "Justice Ridley," one said. "We've been looking for you." Darren stepped back, confusion and fear colliding behind his eyes. "Officer Holtz," the man in the suit said evenly. "You will stay right here." Thomas brushed off his coat and turned back toward the crosswalk, now glowing green. "I believe the lights changed," he said softly, and walked on. Officer Darren Holtz stood frozen, the bitter wind suddenly biting through his uniform. His hand, still near his radio, trembled faintly. Around him, murmurs rippled through the crowd. The woman filming kept her phone steady, eyes narrowed with quiet judgment. The man Darren had just tried to force to the ground, Supreme Court Justice Thomas Ridley, was already halfway across the street, walking alongside his security detail, as if nothing had happened. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouted accusation, just the silent weight of consequence settling into the pavement. Darren didn't move until his sergeant arrived minutes later. "What the hell's going on, Holtz?" Sergeant Alvarez barked, glancing between Darren and the onlookers. "I thought he was—" Darren faltered. He looked Suspicious. Suspicious, Alvarez snapped. That was Justice Ridley, you know who that is? Darren said nothing. Supreme Court. He's the man who wrote the Hamilton versus Price majority opinion. He's one of the most respected legal minds in the country. I didn't know. Did you ask? Alvarez's tone was like gravel. Or did you just see an old black man in a nice coat and assume the worst? Darren flinched. Alvarez turned away, rubbing his temples. You better hope this doesn't hit the news. Body cam on? Darren hesitated. Yes. Alvarez exhaled slowly. Then it's already out of your hands. Across town, Justice Ridley sat quietly in his chambers. The courtroom was 2 floors. Below, and the warmth of polished oak and sunlight through tall windows gave the space a solemn calm. But there was a weariness in Ridley's eyes, a familiar exhaustion that had nothing to do with age. He'd faced worse in his youth, crosses, burned in yards, dogs unleashed on marches, but this was different, subtler, polished in uniform and law. The kind of prejudice that wore a badge, quoted regulations, and whispered procedure as it stripped away dignity. His clerk, Maya, hovered in the doorway. Justice, are you all right? He looked up slowly. Yes, Maya, just reminded. Of? Why? We're still not done. She waited, sensing more. I'm not angry, Ridley said after a moment. I'm tired. That young officer didn't see me. Not really. He saw what he feared, not what stood in front of him. He's going to learn, Maya said. Everyone saw, there's footage already going viral. Ridley nodded slowly. But will he understand? By evening, the video was everywhere. Police officer detains elderly black man. Turns out to be Supreme Court Justice, prejudice in plain sight. Officer confronts power tier and pays the price. It was on the local news by 6 p.m. and national syndication by 8. Talk shows picked it up. Political pundits on both sides scrambled to spin it. Social media exploded with hashtags. Get Justice Ridley. Jerk profiled in public. Accountability now. The video showed everything. Darren's posture, his tone, the moment he dismissed the ID, and the look on his face when the title clicked into place. At the precinct, Darren sat alone in a dim office, replaying the moment over and over in his head. He hadn't meant to disrespect anyone. He wasn't a bad cop, at least that's what he told himself. He'd been on the force 8 years, no complaints, no incidents. But now, there was no avoiding the truth. He hadn't seen a man. He'd seen a threat, and he had acted on that instinct without question. The door creaked open. Captain Jensen stepped in, somber-faced. Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave. Internal review begins tomorrow. Darren nodded, throat dry. Anything to say for yourself? He wanted to blame stress. Training. The way the man had looked at him like he wasn't afraid. But none of it would matter. The footage said enough. I didn't know who he was, Darren muttered. Jensen leaned forward. That's the problem. You shouldn't have needed to. The next morning, the United States Supreme Court released a rare statement. Justice Thomas Ridley was subject to a distressing encounter yesterday that has raised serious concerns about bias and respect for civil liberties. We trust that the appropriate authorities will respond with the gravity this incident demands. Justice is not merely a concept, it is a responsibility. And it applies to all. The words were careful, deliberate, but the message beneath them was thunderous. Cable. News ran round-the-clock coverage. Anchors replayed the now infamous video while legal analysts dissected every interaction. Civil rights leaders called for reform. Political commentators from across the spectrum weighed in. Everyone had an opinion, except Justice Ridley. He gave no interviews, no comment, no public condemnation. Instead, he returned to work. He took his seat at the bench that same afternoon as composed as ever, as though nothing had happened. But inside, something had shifted. Officer Darren Holt sat at his kitchen table, blinds closed, coffee cold. His badge lay in front of him, symbol of the job he'd once believed in. 8 years of service, suddenly dwarfed by one moment that revealed everything he hadn't understood. The department's internal affairs office had already launched an inquiry. The mayor had issued a carefully worded response, and Darren's name, once unknown outside the precinct, now trended alongside phrases like implicit bias and abuse of power. His wife, Nicole, came in quietly and placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her silence was heavy with the question they'd both been avoiding. Who are you, really, when no one's watching? That evening, Maya knocked on Justice Ridley's chamber door. "You've got a visitor." He raised an eyebrow. "Who?" "Someone you know. Says it's urgent." Ridley gestured for her to let them in. The door opened, and in stepped Chief Justice Elena Brooks. Tall, sharp-eyed, her white hair pulled back into a no-nonsense bun, she exuded command with every step. She closed the door behind her. "You made the news," she said. "I didn't intend to. No one intends to get profiled." Ridley offered a faint smile. "I've had colleagues be arrested at airports, pulled over in front of their own homes. This isn't new, but it shouldn't be normal." Brooks sat across from him, folding her hands. "The Department of Justice is asking whether you'd be willing to make a public statement. Something official." "I've already said what I needed to," he replied. I stood still. I stayed calm. I let the officer choose the kind of man he wanted to be. Brooks watched him for a long moment. "You're not angry, are you?" Ridley looked down at his hands. "No. I'm disappointed." Because he wasn't surprised to see me standing there. He was surprised to find out I had power. The next day, a hearing was held in a closed-door session at the precinct. Darren was present, alongside his union representative. So was the police chief, internal affairs, and a few members of the Civilian Oversight Board. They played the footage again. They discussed protocol, training gaps, and racial bias assessments. But in the end, it was more than policy. It was perception. "Officer Holtz," one board member asked gently, "why did you approach him in the first place?" Darren shifted. "He didn't look like he belonged." Silence. "Belonged where?" she pressed. Darren didn't answer, because he already knew. That same evening, Ridley sat with his grandson Caleb, a wiry 17-year-old with eyes full of fire, and a voice sharp from high school debate. "You should have sued him," Caleb said. "You could have ruined his career." "That's not justice," Ridley replied. "But he profiled you, harassed you, in front of everyone. And he'll live with that long after any court decision," Ridley said softly. "Sometimes, son, the most powerful thing you can do isn't punishment, it's clarity. Making someone see the truth for the first time." Caleb folded his arms. "That's not enough for me." Ridley smiled faintly. "It wasn't at your age either." The Supreme Court courtroom was packed. Not because of a landmark case, but because it was the first session held since the incident. Every pew was filled. Law students, journalists, clerks, and curious citizens all watched as Justice Thomas Ridley entered with the same quiet dignity he had carried for decades. There was no mention of what had happened on 14th Street. Not from Ridley, not from the other justices, not from the lawyers arguing before the bench. But the weight of that day hovered in the room like mist. Even the marble walls seemed to listen more closely. After the session adjourned, Ridley took the long hallway back to his chambers, flanked by the portraits of judges who'd shaped American history, some who had fought for justice, others who had delayed it. His footsteps echoed. He paused at a portrait of Thurgood Marshall, the court's first black justice. Ridley stood there for a long time, just looking. Meanwhile, Officer Darren Holtz sat in a small classroom in the basement of a government building. He was halfway through a mandatory retraining course on procedural justice and racial bias. Around him sat other officers, mostly young, mostly white, all scribbling notes in silence. Today's topic, perception versus intent. The instructor, a retired black police captain named Marcus Quinn, paced in front of a projector screen. Intent is what you think you're doing, he said. Perception is what you're actually doing in someone else's eyes. One you can control. The other controls you. Darren's pen paused. Quinn turned toward him. You. What do people see when they look at you in uniform? Darren hesitated. Authority. Good. Now, what do you see when you look at someone who doesn't look like you? Don't answer yet. Just think. The class was quiet. No one looked at each other. It was uncomfortable. And necessary. Later, as the others filed out for lunch, Quinn stopped Darren with a hand on the shoulder. You're not the first officer to make this kind of mistake, he said. But not all of them stick around to learn from it. Darren nodded, shame still clinging like a second skin. I thought I knew what I was doing. You did, Quinn replied. That was the problem. Back at the court, Ridley sat in his office reviewing a draft opinion when Maya stepped in. Justice. Ridley, there's a letter for you. Hand-delivered, no return address. He accepted it without a word, turning it over in his hands. The envelope was plain. Inside, a single sheet of paper. Typed. Dear Justice Ridley, I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope I can earn your understanding. I saw a threat. You were never one. That failure is mine. I'm trying to learn who I am beneath the badge. Thank you for showing me who you were, even when I couldn't see it. Officer Darren Holtz Ridley read it twice, then folded it neatly and tucked it inside the drawer where he kept personal letters, right next to one from John Lewis and another from a student who'd once said Ridley changed her life. He closed the drawer slowly, eyes lingering on it for a moment. That evening, Caleb returned home from school and found his grandfather in the study, reading. You really didn't report him? Caleb asked again, unable to let it go. Ridley looked up from his book. No, he said. He reported himself. But he still has a job. Ridley leaned back in his chair. Do you want justice? He asked. Or do you want vengeance? Caleb frowned. Aren't they the same? No, Ridley said gently. Justice changes people. Vengeance just breaks them. Caleb didn't reply, but he sat down next to his grandfather, quieter than usual. Outside, the city moved on. But inside, something had shifted in both their hearts. 2 weeks had passed and the story hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown louder. Justice Thomas Ridley's quiet grace became a rallying cry in legal circles. Editorials praised his restraint. Civil rights organizations used his example in policy proposals. His encounter had reignited national conversations about systemic bias, accountability, and what real justice looked like. Still, Ridley said nothing more publicly, but others did. At a university town hall in D.C., students chanted his name before a civil liberties lecture. On talk shows, former judges recalled their own stories of being profiled, some years ago, some just months prior. Online, people shared experiences that had once seemed isolated but now felt part of something larger. It was no longer about one cop and one judge. It was about all the times people weren't believed. At the precinct, Officer Darren Holt sat across from an internal review board. It was his final evaluation. The board, made up of department veterans, civilians, and a legal observer, had reviewed hours of footage, not just from the Ridley incident, but from Darren's entire body cam history. They watched how he spoke to suspects, to citizens, to colleagues. The verdict wasn't immediate, but the tone was clear. You are not being terminated, one member finally said, but your role is changing. Darren blinked. What do you mean? You're being reassigned to community liaison duty. You'll be working directly with civilians, outreach programs, conflict resolution, bias training sessions, every week. Darren's mouth opened slightly. That's not a punishment? It's not a promotion either, the board member said firmly. It's an opportunity to learn, to face the people you serve, and to see them as human every single time. Darren exhaled, deeply. Maybe it wasn't redemption. but it was a beginning. In a high school auditorium across town, Justice Ridley was doing something he rarely did, speaking publicly outside a courtroom. The students were young, black, brown, and white, some restless, some curious. Ridley stood behind a worn podium, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened slightly. He didn't talk about the incident. He talked about history. "You know," he said, "I was younger than most of you when I was first called a slur by someone in uniform." The room grew still. "I was your age when I saw my father have to step off a sidewalk because a white officer told him to." He let the words settle. "But I also remember the people who didn't step aside, the ones who stood their ground, not with anger, but with clarity. The ones who made the law better, not just by writing it, but by living it." He looked out at them, eyes kind but fierce. "One day one of you will wear a badge, or a robe, or both, and you'll have a moment, just one, where you'll have to decide if you'll act out of fear or out of truth." A hand rose from the front row. A girl, about 17, sharp glasses and a sharper gaze, asked, "Do you believe the officer who stopped you can really change?" Ridley smiled, not grandly, not for show. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I believe he can try." Later that night, Darren was walking home from a community meeting where he'd just spoken, awkwardly but sincerely, about his mistake. A few attendees had challenged him. One woman had nearly left in tears, but others had stayed behind to shake his hand. As he neared his building, a car pulled up to the curb, a black sedan, government plates, the back window lowered slowly, and there sat Justice Thomas Ridley. Darren froze. "I hear you're doing the work now," Ridley said, voice calm. "Yes, sir," Darren replied, heartbeat thudding. Ridley studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "That's where justice begins," and the window rolled back up. The car pulled away into the darkness. Spring bloomed in the Capitol. The cherry blossoms were in full flourish around the Jefferson Memorial. Tourists crowded the National Mall, and the city pulsed with the kind of hope that could only be found in April air. Inside the Supreme Court building, Justice Thomas Ridley stood in his chambers, packing a box, books, awards, and a framed photo of his wife, gone 6 years now, sat neatly beside a brass nameplate that read simply, "Justice T. Ridley." He was retiring. It wasn't public knowledge yet, but the decision had been made. 32 years on the bench, countless, opinions written, battles fought, some won, many not. But this past month had reminded him of something crucial. Justice doesn't live in marble halls. It lives in daily choices. Across the city, Officer Darren Holtz was getting used to being uncomfortable. Every day brought a new encounter, a tense discussion at a church forum, a wary glance from a teenager at a youth center, or a question he didn't know how to answer, but he kept showing up. He listened more, talked less. He stayed after meetings to clean up chairs. He called people back when they left voicemails about concerns. He read the materials he'd once ignored. He stopped assuming. And slowly, things began to change. Not overnight, but gradually. The community started calling him by name, not badge number. At the neighborhood peace march, someone handed him a water bottle and said, "Glad you're here." And one day, a boy who'd once called him a racist walked over and asked about becoming a cop. Darren didn't know what to say, so he just said, "Let's talk." Justice Ridley's final opinion was read from the bench 1 week later. It wasn't about the economy, or immigration, or executive power. It was a quiet case, one involving a housing dispute in a forgotten district, but his words were anything but small. "Equal protection," he read, "does not mean equal treatment by policy alone. It demands equal recognition, to see someone's humanity before their circumstance, and to acknowledge that dignity is not given by the law. It is simply protected by it." When he finished, the courtroom was silent, and then, slowly, everyone stood. Not because it was required, but because it felt necessary. That evening, Ridley sat on a bench outside the courthouse. watching dusk settle over D.C. The lights flickered, on in the Capitol dome across the way. Footsteps passed by. Life moved around him. Then he heard a voice. "Justice Ridley?" He turned. It was Darren, wearing plain clothes. No badge. Just himself. "I heard it was your last day," Darren said. You wanted to say thank you." Ridley looked at him. The lines on his face were deep, but his gaze was warm. "For what?" "For not burying me with the power you had," Darren said. "For not making it worse than I already did." Ridley chuckled softly. "I didn't need to teach you a lesson. Life's already doing that." There was a pause. "I'm trying to be better," Darren added. Ridley nodded. "Then you already are." He stood and for the first time extended his hand. Darren took it. No cameras, no reporters, no applause, just a handshake between two men. One who had spent his life interpreting the law, and one learning what justice truly meant. Weeks later, the news of Justice Ridley's retirement broke. The country mourned the loss of a legal titan on the bench. Newspapers ran op-eds, law students posted tributes, civil rights leaders called his career a legacy of quiet revolution. But one story wasn't published. It was told years later by a young officer in a classroom full of rookies. "He was the most powerful man I ever met," Darren would say, "and all he had to do to change me was nothing." Then he'd pause. "Nothing. Except treat me like I could be better."